Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's topic is measuring the next normal, and we're going to be looking at how to establish your baseline as a nonprofit when the future is unclear. This is the first of 3 webinars that we have scheduled in our next normal series. So we welcome you to join us 2 weeks from today on June 3rd for the next installment of this webinar series. And we're going to be having a special guest on that webinar that I won't mention just yet, but Matthew is going to be sharing it later on in today's presentation. So don't drop off until the very end. Moving on to the next slide, I wanted to share a couple of housekeeping items with everyone. As a reminder, if you have any questions today or you have to drop off early, we'll be sharing the recording and slides of this presentation with everyone tomorrow. So if you have connection issues or something, you shouldn't worry about having to miss out. If you have a question, you can just drop that right into the Q&A box, which is located on the toolbar at the base of your screen. We've saved the last 5 to 10 minutes of today's presentation for questions.
Hey there, Leah. Have we lost you? We may have. Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Millicarrick. I am Vice President of Analytics and Insight Strategy at Pursuant, and I am co-presenting today with Leah. Leah, if and when you're back, barge in and say hello, but I'll go ahead and can proceed. So Leah and I work together at Pursuant, and I work specifically with our clients to use data and research to bring insight to uncertainty and to inform our clients' growth strategies. Leah and I were chatting before our discussion today about what our quarantine sanity tips are. And she's probably saying right now hers is having a strong internet connection. You're back, Leah?
I'm back, yes. I am
You're
so
back.
sorry about that.
Okay.
I have not had issues at
No
all until this very morning. Anyway,
what's your
but yes,
sanity
I
tip,
was
Leah?
sharing. Yes, my sanity tip, aside from making sure that there are no buggy internet issues, is I like to start my mornings taking a walk before kind of plugging in with work. It helps to kind of replace the time that you might used to have taking, during your commute on the way into the office. So I like to take that time just to sort of like think about what my main goals are for the day and what to attack first.
I love that separation. I think that's really important. Mine is narrowing my focus, and specifically what I mean by that is giving myself the opportunity to escape from the news. And so, perhaps consuming news on a daily rather than hourly basis, or also taking more of a local, narrow focus on what's motivating to me, because as we all know, there's so much going on. So that's what's helped me to get through the past few months and sort of what I stick to and abide by on a day-to-day basis. I was on a call earlier with a big group of folks today too, and we were talking about our pets, and specifically the dogs and cats that are joining us probably today during this session overall. And so I think that's another sanity tip. So I'd say as we kick off, a shout out to all the dogs and cats that are joining us, as well as our participants. So thank you all for being here. And we will go ahead and jump in. So obviously COVID has disrupted lives and livelihoods. I know most of us are currently in the thick of it. Many nonprofits are on the front lines. Their missions have been activated like never before, whether they are directly or indirectly impacted by the virus. And despite this uncertainty, we know that we'll get past this. Many of the clients that we're working with are thinking optimistically to a point where COVID is history. But at the same time, we know that we are going to emerge through this changed. So the Pursuant team is working daily to help nonprofit clients to prepare and position themselves for that post-COVID world that we are envisioning, that we are leaning towards. And this means that we're working with our clients to help them to understand the long-term shifts in donor behavior that are resulting from the crisis. And we're also working with them to understand who their donors are, what they need, and really redefine the approach that they may be following to connect with them through that cause. We do all of that because we believe that if we can strengthen relationships by building trust and loyalty today during a crisis, that we're going to have success with those closest donors in the days that follow coronavirus. So thank you all for being here today and imagining your post-COVID world with us. We have a lot to share, and I'll go ahead and jump in. So I want to kick off with this framework that we call the recovery path. It's likely that you've seen flavors of this in both the for-profit world as well as the nonprofit world. And that idealized world of the post-COVID reality is what we're all gunning for. It's where our vision is set, where we are aiming, and that's at the far right within this framework. The next normal, it's where we are headed. The trick is that we don't know how far away the next normal is. We don't know what the next normal looks like. And frankly, we don't know that all organizations will even make it there. So that's our focus, that's our goal. And what we do know, even though we don't know what the next normal might look like, is that we know that there is a pathway there. And so today I'm going to deconstruct that pathway to the next normal for you so that you can chart your course, so that you can understand patterns of growth and decline as they're happening, and so that you can navigate in an effective way to what that next normal looks like. So I'm going to click down a little bit further on that yellow line and talk specifically about what that yellow line means and sort of how we derived it. At its most fundamental basis, I would think of the yellow line as giving. In your universe, it could be individual giving, it could be overall revenue. But that's the pathway and the impact that COVID has taken on revenue at your organization. And so if I start out at the very far left, at the phase I called cruising, let's go back to good old 2019 and take a quick snapshot of where we were and how we were engaging our donors at that time. Generally, giving was up and continuing a very slow climb, a very slow ascent. Total active donors, so the number of donors that were giving was in decline, and new donors were particularly in decline. I would say that that wasn't a characteristic of 2019, but really of the nonprofit space overall. But most organizations were seeing average gift growth. And so revenue was, if not flat, growing. I would mention just a few economic indicators back from 2019 as well. Unemployment was at its lowest rate in 50 years. The S&P 500 hit a record high at the same time. So I won't wax romantically any further than that. other than to say that what occurred in 2019 as well as 2018, those fundamental trends, both in the nonprofit space and then specifically within your organization, are really vital for us to understand our baseline and the health and strength of our programs as we hit the headwinds and the crisis that we know as COVID-19. So let's jump to the second phase within the recovery path, what we call crisis. And so specifically, our donors are, when we got to the crisis phase, our donors were highly disturbed, worried, concerned, like many of us, and had high focused attention from a day-to-day, monthly perspective on the outbreak. How is it going to affect them, the ones they love, the communities that they're engaged with, they're involved with? And many who felt like they were sitting by on the sidelines or from their armchairs were searching for a way to help. This is a pattern and behavior that we have taken and observed based on past recession giving, as well as disaster response giving. And so we are in this now, and we're seeing very much a similar behavior today. Donors are looking for a way to help today, almost urgent response. On the flip side, organizations are responding in an urgent manner. Many have quick movement, sometimes rash, so that has included certainly the canceling of many events or business as usual that involved face-to-face engagement, certainly with a lot of repercussions there. Early on, some of those cancellations may have seemed rash. In retrospect, certainly prudent now that we understand and know more. But from a communications perspective and a donor engagement perspective, some organizations may have been paralyzed and chosen to do nothing. Others have engaged in more frequent and sustained communications. So continuing to talk to donors, connect with donors. And the giving behavior that we often see that's characteristic of this phase is a surge in terms of giving. So many of the organizations who are on the front lines, who can tell their stories, are connecting with those donors and their communities who want to do something and who want to make an impact. And so that's why the yellow line in terms of giving typically surges during a crisis. At the same time, there's a quick decline. And so that next step within the recovery path, we've termed chasm. The reason we call it chasm is we don't know precisely how deep it is. We don't know precisely what the climb out of the chasm looks like. And we don't know how long it's going to take. So those are the big unknowns about this very important phase within the recovery path. And from a donor perspective, we should be prepared for our donors to be fatigued. In many cases, they may be tapped out from both an attention perspective, because they've got so much to connect with or engage with, from competing priorities, because we certainly know that there is so much need right now. And so donors are often prioritizing who needs ongoing support from them. And then at the same time, our donors don't know how long and how deep the chasm might be from a personal economic perspective. And so their resources are limited in that regard as we work to restore the economy and return to a place of health. So donors are generally fatigued and being more selective during this phase about who to support. How are organizations responding? In most cases, through stewardship. So they are telling the impact of a gift that was given, They're telling the role that they are playing from a needs perspective. The best organizations are focusing a case for support on ongoing giving and why it matters to continue support. Organizations are also looking to make an investment in their most stable supporters. And what we mean by that is using data and insight to understand who donors are that can have the greatest impact. Not just giving the greatest gifts, but who likely have been giving for the longest amount of time, or also who have strongest and closest connection to an organization. So organizations, nonprofits are looking to understand who those donors are so that they can stick with the organization through the rocky periods. From a giving behavior perspective, so again, this is back to the yellow line at this phase, we often see lower than normal giving. So relative to where we were in 2019 at the cruising phase, we often see giving during this chasm, this period of recovery, being lower than normal, but with hints of recovery. And so you see a little bit of a blip there, a jump, and then a pause, and then a steady climb as well. So again, a lot of uncertainty at that phase, and that's why we don't see a direct climb from there. And lastly, I want to round out with the next normal. Again, the direction that we're headed and our vision for emerging from the crisis. Our donors, when we get to that next normal, are actually in a position of strength with us. They have greater affinity for the organizations that they have shared experiences with. And by that, I mean they have heard our stories of the impact that we have made together, of how we've strengthened communities and served those in need. And we emerge from the next normal in a partnership, a collaboration on a shared path forward. Organizations at the same time are developing growth channels based on new donor preferences. And we're going to talk a bit about that ahead. But when we emerge from the next normal, recall that we're going to be changed. We're going to be different. And what that means is we have adapted based on the new face of philanthropy and the new fundraising landscape, whatever that might be. So organizations that emerge from that as part of the next normal understand what those changing trends are, and then they are adopting those practices as business as usual. And where that leads us from a giving behavior perspective is we have established higher levels of giving before even 2019 along the way. So I know that there's a lot sort of contained within all of this. And specifically, I want to get around to finding yourself within this model. And so that's where we will focus on for the majority of our discussion today. I would double click on the chasm phase of the recovery model in a little more depth, because finding where you sit within the recovery model really depends on the type of organization that you are. If you look at my yellow line, it looks somewhat like a sad or a slouchy W right now. But the reality in many places is that no economic recovery model fits a single region of the country or a nonprofit vertical. Individually, nonprofit organizations need to listen for the signs of change. And so that's what we'll help you to do as part of our discussion. And then understand as donor engagement is changing and understand what recovery really looks like. I've pulled in some for-profit examples to illustrate what a chasm might look like for different types of organizations. That chasm could be a strict V, we would term that a quick bounce. And what that means in many cases is certainly there has been profound economic damage. But companies like Netflix, who are largely digitally driven, digitally distributed, can even serve as an alternative for amusement, gatherings, entertainment, or otherwise. Netflix is very likely to see a very quick bounce from a recovery model, from a recovery perspective. An alternating view might be a U-shaped recovery of a chasm, which isn't necessarily a quick bounce, but is a slow recovery. So a little more time digging out. And Home Depot is a great example in the sense that in my community, I'm in Austin, Texas, Home Depot has remained largely open through this period, has adapted by staying open with modified hours, modified capacity, but and then also has offered online ordering and curbside pickup. So recovering, but a slower recovery with some adaptation. And then a worst case scenario I would throw in might be those that require long-term change. And so specifically, a lot of organizations with a travel orientation like Royal Caribbean may need to fundamentally change what their model looks like. And so in their case, I would categorize and qualify that as more of an L-shaped recovery. I'd throw out, I've even seen talk and discussion of a W-shaped recovery. So something like a V, but that has, a couple steps to that climb. The net really of all of this is asking yourself, how has my organization been affected, and what type of recovery can we expect to see? So when we look at the nonprofit space in particular, we can see that the crisis has affected organizations in different ways, in myriad ways, especially when we talk about revenue in particular. So many organizations who have leapt to the front lines to provide frontline support and are continuing to do so are able to activate their missions. We see organizations that were affected by campus closure, or really any way that a visitation center might be involved. Organizations have had to change the ways that they do business. And certainly in the higher ed space, those campuses are also associated with revenue. So we know that there is fundamental impact as those campuses remain closed. Many nonprofits have been affected by canceling events or really need to reshape or remold them to virtual events. So specifically what we're talking about there are peer-to-peer events that were often a chance for communities to come together, maybe the only chance to be visible, to be seen, to connect. At the same time, for those organizations, they serve not only as revenue drivers, but also as a way to welcome new members into the community. So they served as acquisition. So certainly organizations who are reliant on face-to-face engagement, whether they are galas, canvassing, or peer-to-peer events, have been affected. And then there's a whole host of other organizations who are able to activate around mission and engage with different types of organizations. So those who step up their game when we're challenged with this recovery will be better off and far more ready to confront the challenges that are ahead versus those who don't. And so I'd ask each of you to consider what your recovery looks like. Will it have more of that U shape? Will it be V-shaped, which feels less and less likely for many organizations instead of an L? So really wanted to lead with some of that thinking and some of that context and framework about what a recovery model can look like.
Hey,
So
Matthew.
I want to get, yes.
Yes. I had a really great question come in, and I'd love to pose it while we're sort of in this section of the presentation around sort of, where to situate yourself in recovery. And so we had one question come in that asked, does volunteerism follow much the same patterns as giving, with the exception of isolation and physical closures?
Yeah. Wow, that's a really great question that I'd want to explore in more detail. So, I would say the previous patterns that we have followed to explore this model have typically been recessionary giving, where time actually might be more and more available. So individuals have more of a way to help beyond financially alone. And so I'd say the quick answer is I don't know, especially around COVID response, where exposure to other individuals certainly can have an impact. So I'd have to frame the answer there to us being in times like no others. And I would have to say, certainly there's going to be an impact on traditional volunteerism and simply exposing ourselves to one another. And then identifying and understanding new and different ways that we can engage with organizations and support organizations around the scope of volunteerism. So in that regard, I'm confident that new ways to volunteer will emerge out of need and desire to also protect those volunteers. I don't have insight on patterns of recovery or the impact of volunteerism around recessions or recessionary giving. So I want to pick up and now introduce the concept of our recovery report card. So I think that fundamentally measurement needs to serve as the basis for critical decision making that will move each of our organizations out of crisis to recovery and that long-term growth. So as fundraisers, we need to be able to understand trends, momentum, and the direction that we're all headed as we pivot our programs, as we retool individuals for this distance economy that we're all stepping into. So the way that we're going to do that to measure our progress, to help us decide if we're still in crisis or if we are in the chasm, is through a recovery report card. And so I've included one from the mid-90s here from a student who got positive marks for having a good attitude. So she's likely thriving today as well as she works to dig out of COVID-19. For our purposes today, we are going to introduce the concept of report card with you. We're going to detail some key measures that the report card will track, and then we will share and send a report card to each of you as a follow-up outside of our discussion today. So the report card has four key measures, key areas for tracking that are going to help us to understand how the forces of the economic recession as well as COVID response have impacted each of us. The first focuses on overall fundraising, the second on donor retention, the third on channel and program migration that might be occurring, and then the last is on donor movements. And specifically, what we're talking about there are upgrades and downgrades. So let's unpack each of the metrics that we see here. The first is overall fundraising. And specifically, what we want to be able to answer is how is your program performance changing over prior years? So I talked about that phase of cruising in 2019, and certainly we want to have an understanding of the path that we were on, our relative strength as the crisis hit. And so I would say that these metrics to track overall fundraising are really basic and straightforward. What we would want to look at is donors, and what you see here is donors by month that I've taken in the top chart, and then revenue. So pretty straightforward, revenue by month. And again, this would be in advance of COVID because we want to track what our performance was as we were cruising. In addition to donors and revenue, so getting that pre-crisis perspective, we also want to track average gift. So also a very simple calculation, but we know that in the 2008 recession, that the biggest effect was not on the total number of donors giving, but it was actually on the donation size or average gift. So we will expect to observe a decline in average gifts given as we continue to shift from that phase of crisis to the chasm. And so average gift is something I would definitely monitor and continue to watch for your own organizations as well. So we wanted to start there. I think it's also important to track the number of new donors that your organization has, as well as those that are reactivated. The reason I would say that is, as I shared earlier, many organizations have been affected based on their face-to-face fundraising and their ability to get in front of individuals within their community. And so most certainly, we believe that acquisition will be impacted for organizations who no longer have the ability to build those direct personal relationships. And so certainly that's a key metric that we would track from an overall fundraising perspective. And then a little tip that I would have for each of these metrics is to abide by a 24-month moving average. What that allows us to do, if we take a 24-month moving average, is to smooth out inherent volatility that you're going to see on your file. So if you have a major spring event every year, taking an average will smooth that out for us so that we can get a monthly read. And if you're like most nonprofit organizations and you typically have a stellar December, again, a moving average will allow you to smooth that volatility out. So we'd recommend that you do that for both your donors as well as your revenue. And you can do that as well for these other key metrics of your average gift, as well as new and reactivated donors as well.
Hey, Matthew.
Yes.
Yes, a couple quick questions. So one is, how would you go about calculating this 24-month moving average gift? And then we also had a question. So when we're talking about average gifts, are we talking about the average amount of gifts? So the average quantity of gifts that you're given? Are we referring to or the average gift given? Maybe just dive into that a little bit with a little bit more specificity.
Yeah. Specifically what I'd want to monitor here, I'll answer your second one first, is I would want to track average donation amount. So the average gift that a donor makes to you. And the thinking and the theory here is that disposable income is affected Donors don't have line of sight on what recovery looks like and perhaps are being a bit more cautious, and therefore still love you as an organization, but are simply giving less to you as part of that gift. So that's the thinking of tracking that average donation amount. And then as far as what that moving average looks like, it's a really simple calculation. My goal here, again, is for tracking 24 months. So that means looking back at data for 2 years. That's ideally, that's a really smoothed out perspective. You could also go back just 12 months. And the way that you would calculate that for 12 months for your number of donors, for instance, is to, you could look at my top chart, would be, so that's 12 months of data, and it's simply to add up all of those donors that have given, and then to divide them or average them out and then divide them by 12. So what that gives you is a smoothed out perspective in a single month that you're in. And then in this example, we call it a moving average. When we move beyond, this was December 2018, but when we move to January 2019, what we would do in this example is include the new month in the 12-month roll, and then drop the first month, the oldest month, from that moving average. So that allows us to incorporate newest data into our perspective, and then really detect those subtle changes as giving increases or decreases. So I'm going to jump ahead to our second area of focus, and this is specifically on donor retention. So the reason we want to understand donor retention within a recession is we want to understand who are our most loyal donors. And then we also want to understand what are strategies that we can invest in to hold on to those most loyal donors. I mentioned on a previous section that we typically expect to see within a recession declining household income, lower capacity to give. And so those individuals certainly are going to give less if they don't fall off of our file. But at the same time, we also have organizations that have lower connection to our own organization. They may have been recruited, for instance, from an event participant to make a gift, live in a different state, and really don't have an ongoing connection to us. Frankly, I'd put new donors in the category of more fragile or perhaps transaction-oriented donors, because we simply don't have the relationship that we have with those donors that we do with other donors who have been on our file longer. And so the simple direction here as part of tracking donor retention is to look at your overall donor retention. What you see here, this was taken from our Giving DNA, Pursuant's Giving DNA platform. For this organization is really spiky donor retention that has a lot to do with activities that occur on a month-by-month basis. So a 12-month rolling average is also valuable here. What we would want to do is monitor that donor retention over time and understand, are we losing some of our core donors who have been engaged with us on our file. And if you have the ability to track donor retention based on life cycle, I think you can get an even richer view. So beyond just tracking overall donor retention, we love the idea of tracking how well new donors are staying on your file and making a second gift. And during a recession, if we're able to hold on to those folks. And then also, we'd recommend that you track your most loyal donors, and that's what we call key multi-year donors, and looking at their retention rates. And what is the impact of being in crisis, being in our chasm for those key multi-year donors. So those folks who have been giving from a long-term perspective, who know us best. They are our bedrock, our foundation. So what you're seeing at the right is overall donor retention. Typically, we might see key multi-year donors substantially higher. So if your average for overall is about 40, your key multi-years might be in the neighborhood of 60 or 70%. Again, they've given multiple years in a row to you. Whereas we might see new donors in the painful neighborhood of around 20% year over year retention for those folks. So that was, when we were cruising. Now what we want to understand is, are we fundamentally losing some of those folks who were valuable? What's changed so dramatically? And so tracking donor retention through economic recovery can be really important and vital for understanding how our base of support is changing. So I'm going to jump to a more sophisticated concept, and that's really channel and program migration. And the question we want to ask here is, as we are positioning ourselves for the next normal, how is our organization adapting to shifting donor preference? I shared the example earlier of Home Depot and how on a recent visit, I saw so many individuals prepared to fulfill on curbside delivery from same-day orders. That's an example of a business adapting. And so the same question, I would have the same question for nonprofits that we work and engage with. How are they abiding by donor preference? And what if that preference is moved fundamentally and forever? How will we know? And so this set of metrics focused on both channel migration as well as program migration are going to help us to look at what those dynamics look like. So the first area of focus I'd encourage you to explore is simply the transition between online and offline giving. We know from benchmarking reports that across the nonprofit space, at least 12% of all giving, individual giving, is now raised from online gifts. So a lot of room for growth. I heard a crazy stat in the news earlier this week that said in April that e-commerce providers had more website traffic every single day than they normally have on Black Friday. But they had those e-commerce providers had that traffic every single day of the month in April. That is fundamental change. I don't know whether it continues, what that traffic falls to, but that's fundamental change. And so from a nonprofit perspective, we have to believe that digital transformation is going to accelerate, and we need to keep our finger on that. And so the key high-level metrics that we would track to observe that migration, to observe that change, is total online giving as a percentage of overall giving to your organization. And I would probably frame overall as your direct response giving. And then let's also look at total offline direct response giving as a percentage of overall. What that's going to give us is show us over time what that migration looks like. And then it also gives us a position for planning and investment in the year ahead. So if we aren't focused on the giving of those individuals who've migrated online or preferred online, then we're not meeting the needs of our donors. I would also look at retention impact by channel as well. So how well are we holding on to our donors? We know traditionally offline has been a strength for us, direct mail specifically a strength for us from a retention perspective. And so the story is more nuanced than just those overall direct numbers. And then in addition to channel migration, we'd encourage you to look at program migration at a very highest level. So what we specifically are talking about here is what are our year-over-year trends in terms of major gift giving when face-to-face meetings can no longer be held, when our core donor base is perhaps also the most vulnerable. We look at direct mail and the role that direct mail can play. How have our programs shifted from an events and a monthly giving perspective? The net really here, depending on how your overall fundraising program is structured, is that we want to look at these changes not just in silos alone, that one program is up versus another program area is down, but specifically keeping tabs on the migration that is occurring. Because when we emerge from the chasm phase to the next normal, this is going to be really important to see where we land.
Matthew, another question I'd like to throw in the mix. So we had a great question that said, how do you weigh channel preference by donor to determine preference?
Right. Channel preference by donor. Yeah, that's a great question. And so we've got a lot of tools that can do that. So one of them, the most straightforward, is simply looking at consumer data. So I've shared that all of the slides that you've seen up to now are the charts are taken from the Giving DNA platform, the Pursuant Giving DNA platform. And the way our platform works is that as donors are loaded, we actually we use augmented intelligence tools to augment individual profiles and append consumer insights to each individual record. So specifically, that gives us things like party affiliation, political party affiliation, philanthropic giving in other categories, household income information. But in addition to that, we get channel preference and channel insight. So I would say that that is the most direct manner that we've used to look at what that consumer information is. And specifically, that's based on consumer models of individuals' online behavior as well as offline behavior, whether you're searching, purchasing, or otherwise. So that's a direct way. Otherwise, I would say we've worked with organizations to build models based on response mechanism and solicitation device. And I'd say that's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more of an investment to ultimately arrive at what that channel preference looks like. So sort of two approaches that you might follow there. So I'll round out our last section and then show us what all of it coming together looks like. The last area that I'd encourage to focus on as you build your own report card is donor movement. And specifically, I've talked a lot about shifting donor preference. It's not just about channels, but it's really how I'm engaging and supporting the organizations that I love. Donor movement is going to show us that long-term fundamental change. So this chart that you see over at the right, also from the Pursuant Giving DNA platform, shows on a monthly basis what that donor movement looks like. And so over at the left would be our recommendation on what we want to track and what we want to follow. Specifically, we simply want to see which donors have doubled down on the relationship that they have with us by giving a larger gift. So quite simply, what we're trying to track here are donor upgrades. I also want to know what donors we've retained at the same level. So I'm calling that donor maintenance, really donors giving at the same level. I also want to track donor downgrades and then giving frequency. So like we shared earlier, in terms of expected behavior that we would see as part of economic recovery, we would expect to see quite a few downgrades as we monitor that average gift amount and as uncertainty takes hold with consumer sentiment as individuals choose to change the ways that they're supporting our organization. So I wanted to wrap on this particular slide from a donor movement perspective. And now I want to show you how to put it all together. So I've talked a lot about metrics. I introduced the concept of the report card, but now I want to show you how you can use it together. And I hope you guys are able to see this. If you squint, though, you will get the gist because the data, I would say, is less important than how to use that report card. So the first thing I'd say to orient you is to take a look at the yellow curve. That's what I'm calling our predicted recovery curve. And specifically, what we shared earlier when I talked about the 4 phases of recovery, from cruise-in, crisis, chasm, and the next normal. That's the curve you saw earlier, but it's effectively flattened. And so that is what we expect to observe in the philanthropic space as we're trying to decide what phase of recovery we are in. The dotted yellow line between May and June is where we are today. And so what this is telling us, and what this will be able to tell us as we complete it with our own insights and our own information, is where are we today? Because fundamentally, that's really what we're trying to answer. What I can't answer for us, again, is how long does crisis last? Or how long will the chasm be? And so that's really what you'll be playing with as you receive this and as you start coloring it in with your own data, is when does the next normal begin? And how will I know that I'm there? And so we're just in it now, but as you use this information to complete your report card, you'll start to have some of that perspective. I do want to share this snapshot of a single client that we have worked with and worked on, and I would say they have certainly been aggressive in maintaining communication, showing the impact that the outbreak has had on their organization, and really stepping up as they engage with their donors. And what's really interesting to me is if we look at that cruise-in phase in December 2019, they had a pretty blockbuster December year. Substantially higher revenue than they had in previous months. I suspect that many of you had the same type of year if you have a similar type of program, but see that typical customary December bump. What we see within crisis is really sustained giving that is actually, if I look both at the number of donors as well as the revenue that has been given to support this organization, is that it was far higher than levels it had previously been when we were at the cruise-in phase. And then specifically, I see very strong April giving, and I would suspect for many of you who have maintain close connection and communication with your donors, that you may have seen something that is very much the same. And so we're seeing giving in April that almost match their December giving. We're seeing not quite as many donors, but this organization, we're seeing them step up. And so, again, we're only early into the process of recovery, but what will be very interesting for us to track as we engage with this client in more detail is how long will we be in the crisis phase? And so I hope the descriptions that we've shared up to now will help you to understand that for your own organization. But also, when we are in the chasm phase, being able to look at and mark the signs of recovery and to understand when that climb out begins. And so I focused predominantly and primarily on revenue here in the sense that it's the sort of our purest read. But at the same time, more sophisticated metrics can be tracked to give us some insight into, as we dig out, how my program is changing. Am I holding on to donors? Is it new donors that were supporting us? And then also, are we primarily transitioning to an online program versus those in other program areas as we're digging out, as we move beyond crisis to that chasm phase. So we'll be sending this out as a Google Doc early next week, and you'll have the ability to make it your own, apply and adapt it. I also want to give a little bit of time to talking about additional resources as well as Q&A. So I've mentioned and referred to the Pursuant Giving DNA platform. We offer a free trial for that on our website. It will help to take your donor and transaction information and empower you with visualization tools to look back and then also look forward as you are gauging your progress on a monthly basis. We love the Fundraising Effectiveness Project AFP report, as well as Blackbaud Donor Centrics Index. Both are available quarterly, and so those can give us insight into how we are performing against the industry, and so those will be the earliest measures that we'll see ahead. So I'd encourage you, as you work to establish your own baseline, to explore all of those resources. And then also want to share that today was pretty much level one in terms of establishing your baseline. But as Leah shared early on June 3rd, we will be having a conversation with Angelique Chow, who is the Director of Measurement Strategy and Insights at Feeding America. And she's going to talk about what her recovery planning looks like, how she is measuring recovery, and what scenario development looks like at her organization. So we know that Feeding America has been in the thick of it and are really excited to have her here, and we hope that you guys will all join. And then later in the month, on June 23rd, we'll pivot from talking about establishing your baseline to really measuring the impact of stewardship and communication, what we would almost call indirect impacts that will be really vital as we thank donors for making their gift. So, so stay tuned, look out for invitations to our second and third webinars as part of our series in terms of measuring the next normal. And then lastly, I'd share that I realize it's a big lift to not only pull your own information to look at where you are, but in many cases, that's in support of scenario planning, development, and reshaping your own roadmap. And so the Pursuant Fundraising Strategy Assessment is an all-in-one approach that pairs and partners you with an agency resource that can look at your program performance, assess where you are in terms of recovery, and then work with you to prioritize a roadmap for growth by activating the right donors with the right messages with the impact that you need to have. And that leverages the Giving DNA platform I referenced previously. So reach out to us if you have any questions about that full approach or what the fundraising strategy assessment looks like. And with that, I realize I'm just about at time. So I'll turn it over to Leah with any questions that you might want to share.
Hey, Matthew, thank you so
Yes.
much.
Sure.
This has been, we've had some great feedback on that I've been monitoring over in the Q&A. A lot of people have some really specific questions about certain slides. And so in the interest of time, we will be following up with every one of you personally. So we'll be sending you guys an email with the specific answer to your question. And then also we will be sending out the recording and slides of this presentation to everybody who registered tomorrow. So if there's something that you wanted to go back and take a closer look at, you'll be able to do that once you receive that tomorrow. And I think I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up for today in respect to everyone's time. Matthew, thank you again for putting all this all together for us.
Of course. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks so much, Leah, for having me.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.